Welcome back. Thank you guys for joining us for our 53rd episode. So we've been here for over a year. We're still here, which surely that means like we've made it in like the top X% of podcasts. I'm sure there's some stat there that like, I don't know, 95% of podcasts don't make it through the first year. Maybe. I'll make that stat up now. So I feel like it's an achievement. Congratulations, Chris. You made it through the first year. I know you've been doing podcasts before that anyway. In fact, we both have, so it's not
Professional
actually that much of an
podcaster, me.
achievement.
Yes.
Yes. But anyway, thank you guys for joining us for over a year of episodes. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thanks, Jake.
Just trying to think if we have any announcements we don't get, but we will have some soon, so stay
We
tuned.
will have, yes. I'm very excited about that, but we shall keep quiet about it till next week.
We will. Yes, I shouldn't have said anything. Okay, let's jump into the goods. So I'm going to give you guys a workout plan. We're going to talk about, so last week we did a golden era plan. I forget whose it was, but it was wild. Serge Nubret. It was like 4 million sets or something absolutely insane like that. So I thought, you know what, we need to swing the pendulum back. We need to go back to silver era. We need to look at maybe a little bit more, sane type of plan. And we've got one from George Eiferman today. Now, we have talked about George Eiferman, I think once before, and he was a fairly important figure in the silver era. So, you know, the fact we've made it a whole year and only mentioned his name, I think once is pretty impressive. But Eiferman he was another one of these characters who bridged the gap between the early silver era and coming into the golden era, or I guess you would call it kind of early golden era. So he started competing in the late 40s. And so he was kind of like, I guess, the generation after people like Steve Reeves and Reg Park. He still kind of cut his teeth in the York barbell kind of scene. And he didn't start winning competitions until I think he won Mr. Philadelphia or something like that in maybe 1948 or late 40s. And then he won the Universe in the early 60s. So he was very much a kind of like tail end of the silver era. And he's got an interesting backstory. I mean, you've talked about this kind of idea before where these guys back then, before they stepped foot in a gym, they were more active. Like they were just doing more physically with their bodies than most people are today. And they'd acquired quite a lot of muscle. And it's interesting with Eiferman because we've actually got some of his stats, and he was I think he was in the Navy, some defense force. And in his time in the defense force, he didn't lift weights. Like they were using buckets of water and bags of flour and stuff like that. And they were doing physical activity, but they weren't actually, in a gym. And he gained something like 25 pounds in his time in the military. And so by the time he stepped foot in a gym, he was almost 200 pounds. He was 190, 195, something along those lines. So it's interesting if you were to then look at someone like Eiferman back then, the amount he's going to be able to gain in the gym is going to be significantly less in total than if you've got a beginner today who, has been sitting on the couch, playing games, whatever, hasn't really been active. And, a lot of the time people will ask, well, how much can I gain? How much muscle as a newbie, as a beginner? How much can I gain in a year? And you've answered this before. It depends on what you've been doing. If you've been sedentary, it's going to be a hell of a lot more than if you're someone who's out there, hiking and playing sports and whatnot. Anyway, so that was Eiferman. He was active before he stood from the gym. And what we've got here today is a plan that he was following in the late 40s. So this is, a few years into his training. He's started, working towards some of these competitions, Mr. Philadelphia. And in the past episode of his, we covered a plan from the 50s where he talked about what was his favorite plan. That was his most favorite routine. And so this is an earlier plan of his. And if you guys are interested, go back and listen to that episode. I think it's like maybe episode 38 or something like that. And compare how these differ, because I actually think this is a better plan, in my opinion. But you guys don't know what this plan is yet, so let me enlighten you. So it was a multi-set plan as well. I'll mention that. So he used at least 2 sets for each exercise, except possibly the first exercise. So the first exercise was hack squat. And he would often do this with 3 sets of 5 to 10 repetitions, but sometimes he would swap in a breathing squat. So we have talked about the breathing squat before. So breathing squat would be a single set of 20 repetitions, but you've broken it up. So depending on how you would perform it, it might be that you do 10 repetitions and that 10 reps will be more or less to like, close to failure. And then you would sort of do these little rest, pause kind of mini sets and get 20 reps in total. So sometimes he would do that. Sometimes he would just do 3 sets of 5 to 10 repetitions. Then he would go from the squat, and we talked about rest periods last week, and it'd be interesting. It'd be interesting to track how long one would need to rest for after doing a set of breathing squats. But anyway, so he then went into a wide grip barbell bench, and again, it was 3 sets of 5 to 10 repetitions. And then a flat dumbbell chest press. Now, my understanding of the way Eiferman did these was it was a little bit more, more neutral grip. So we've contrasted that wide grip bench to a slightly closer grip with the dumbbell chest press. And that was for 2 sets of 5 to 10. And then we have bent over barbell row. I think that was more sagittal plane. And that was 3 sets of 5 to 10. And then a behind the neck barbell press. I think he did these seated, but they were being done seated and standing at this time. And he did 3 sets of 5 to 10 for the behind the neck. And then we have a single leg squat. Now, I lied. This was done for a single set. Okay, so we do have an exercise here for single set. So single leg squat for 1 set of 5 to 10. So a pistol squat kind of variation. And then we've got calf raises, 3 sets of 25, which we've talked about in the past. Probably just a limitation on equipment and load that they can use. And then a barbell curl for 3 sets of 5 to 10. And then a triceps pulley push down. So I guess what we would use with a cable, 3 sets of 5 to 10. So we have 9 exercises in total, almost each exercise 2 or 3 sets with the exception of the single leg squat or maybe the breathing squat. And relatively low, I would say, repetitions, 5 to 10, similar kind of rep scheme we see from people like Steve Reeves as well. What are your thoughts on that one?
So this is interesting. I mean, obviously, everything I say here is kind of going to be talking about minutiae, really, because in essence, it is a very Soviet era program. There are lots and lots of programs that are very much like this. So ultimately, I'm really splitting hairs with any kind of comments that I make on this. There are things about this, but having said that, there are things about this that I do like quite a lot, and there are also things that I don't like about it quite a lot. So it is polarizing me a little bit compared to the average or more common Soviet era program. So I do like the 5 to 10 rep range. I like that because often, I'm comfortable with a wider rep range. I think,
Yes.
I can see practical reasons why people might want to go up as high as 15 sometimes. But I'm generally much happier if I'm programming 5 to 8, 5 to 7, that kind of zone. So when I see 5 to 10, I'm pretty happy with that. I like that because I think it makes the most sense for post-workout recovery processes.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I don't like the volume programming. Again, it works. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, I've got a quibble around the chest work, but I would prefer to see a little bit more exercise variation and a little bit less, multi-set protocol. I think that is not a good use of time and energy and recovery capacity. So, I think there's that sort of balance trade-off, if you like. I would prefer to be on the variety side rather than on the, just raw volume side. I counted it out, and it's actually obviously if you count the superset, it's 10 exercises, not 9.
Yeah, that's right. With the breathing squat, he would do that superset with the pullover as they generally did, which usually they would do high reps, 20 reps, and not normally taken to failure. It was more like a light
So
pullover.
if he was just doing hack squats, he wouldn't superset with pullover. Is that what you're saying? Because that's not what you've written.
I believe the way it was written, I believe he was insinuating that this superset would be done with the breathing squats, but
not with the hack squat.
But perhaps not. I'd have to go back and double check how he wrote it.
It doesn't really matter, but it's just interesting because the pullover would be obviously another back exercise, and it would put the number of sets up in total. So I counted, if you count that he was doing a pullover supersetting with the hack squat, which we don't we're not sure about. If he was doing that, then you'd have 27 total sets, which is actually quite a lot. I mean, it's not like a lot, but it, it is, you're going to notice, like I'm much more comfortable kind of in that sort of 12 to 15 total kind of sets per workout. I think pushing it up double that and I'm squeaking. I think that's starting to become, definitely a challenge. And I'm going to think that there's going to be exercise order issues towards the end of the workout, unless they're being really spaced out with lots of intra-workout nutrition and rest and that kind of thing. So there's bits and pieces here that I'm not, super happy about. Exercise selection, I mean, again, very classic silver era stuff that we've covered 100 times or 52 times so far on this podcast. I don't like doubling up the chest work. I really don't like that. I don't, even though the wide grip is, obviously the starting point, which is going to get most, all the chest regions. Even if the dumbbell chest press is more sort of narrow grip, I'm still not. I mean, I can see why he's doing that because he's then got the behind the neck press, which is more middle delt, and then he's trying to go for some anterior delt work. But the way he's programming it, I think it would be so much better if he had a steep incline version where he was getting very much more definitively, kind of anterior delt rather than being very much clavicular pec pretty much entirely. So I'm not really a fan of that combination, especially when he's doing multi-set stuff. Again, with the pec being so much more susceptible to damage, I really don't think that will be the one muscle that I would kind of throw a load of volume at. I don't think it makes an enormous amount of sense. Equally, the exercise selection more generally I really like. I like the squat, the bench, as in the wide grip bench. I like the behind the neck press, calf raise, curl, triceps push down, fantastic. Obviously, people are waiting for me to say that, I'm missing the wide grip pull down or pull up, and I'm missing the stiff leg deadlift or other hamstrings exercise, because that's what I always say. And we are missing those things, and it'd be great to see them in. We don't actually have a shrug in there either, and I think that's definitely something that I'd want to see. So, it's a classic.
Which, you know what? There's a lot of the plans we've looked at don't really have any direct trap work. And there's every now and then there will be some, but a shrug was not that common. Obviously, there tended to be quite a lot of deadlifting. Sometimes I would do like a deadlift with a shrug at the top. So I guess I would rely more on those exercises. But it's almost, what do they leave out more? Hamstrings or traps? Probably about the same.
Hamstrings definitely is neglected quite severe. But yeah, I mean, as is a wide grip kind of pull down or pull up. So, I mean, that is just one of those things that tends to get ignored. But, fundamentally, done 3 times a week on non-consecutive days, this is a great program. Again, I mean, like a lot of the time when we're going through these programs and I'm picking them apart and saying what I don't like about them, I often sometimes just neglect to emphasize that even with all my criticisms, this is still going to be 100 times better than most of what you're going to see online today, which is mad, but it's true.
Yeah, a couple of interesting observations, I think. So you've made the point there that chest volume is obviously quite high, and he could have been doing an incline, for example. And there were people at York doing incline dumbbell chest press. Steve Reeves was doing that, for example. So I don't know why he didn't do that, but it is interesting nonetheless to observe that almost all these exercises he is doing with 3 sets, but the dumbbell chest press he's dropped one of those sets. He's only doing 2. I can only imagine it's because he's observed that there is, some additional recovery demand if he did add that 3rd set to that exercise because he is doubling up on chest work. So I think it's interesting to see that there's been some thought process there, presumably based on his own personal response to that workout. I don't, anyone who writes a program, it's always nicer if things are even and uniform. You always want to make everything look the same, and then there'll be requirements that force you not to. So there's obviously been something here that's forced him to drop that set, I imagine. The single leg squat is an interesting choice, and it's not something you see much of.
Yeah, I honestly just, I forgot to mention that. I would just take that out. I mean, I don't see it adding anything at all. I mean, just as a very, very quick kind of practical comment, if I were doing this routine or modifying this routine to do, personally, I would just take everything down to a single set, and I would, just because I'm old, But I mean, you could still do, 2 sets probably, or even 3 if you wanted to per exercise. Um, I would take out the dumbbell chest press. I would take out the single leg squat, um, and I would put in the stiff leg deadlift. I'm keeping it in the Silver era kind
Yeah,
of equipment,
yeah.
limitations. I put in a stiff leg deadlift, put in a shrug, and I put in a wide grip pull down or pull up, and that would probably make the routine pretty much perfect for me in the
Mm,
context of this
mm.
equipment limitation situation. Obviously, you say, oh well, you've got leg curls and kind of knee extension and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, but I know, but I'm trying to keep it in the context of the equipment that we've got. So it's actually not really very much that I need to do.
No, no. And like you said, your preference is to do single sets, but someone could do two
You could
sets. They could,
absolutely do 2 sets for all of that. You could even push it to 3, I think.
yeah. Yeah, and especially if you look at something like triceps, he's got the triceps pushed down, he's got the close grip or the more sagittal plane chest press, he's got even behind the neck, like he's got a lot of variation in there for triceps, or chest. Technically speaking, yes, he could have adjusted that slightly, but he's still got exercises here for some of these muscle groups. Delts, another one where he's getting some regional differences in the exercise selection. So certainly could be a lot worse. I think, given limited equipment, barbell, dumbbell, I mean, he does have a pulley, but most of this is dumbbell and barbell. I think it's not bad. Yes, we're missing hams. Yes, we could do the back work a little bit better. Yes, there's 1 or 2 exercises we don't need. But physiologically speaking, it's, rep range good, volume, most of that should be recoverable. I don't like the order of putting like a squat number 1, unless you're happy to wait 5 or 10 minutes before you do and maybe he was happy to do that. But
He probably just went
aside
over
from,
and chatted with his friend for like 15 minutes and came
I mean, if he
back.
was doing this at York, I mean, far out, those guys are spending hours just mucking about. So yeah, maybe. But yeah, all in all, like I think this looks like a fairly fun workout, and it's relatively physiologically sane as opposed to some of the stuff we've seen in past episodes and in the golden era. Now, the 5 to 10 rep range. So I thought that was interesting, and this is a change I've made based on what we've talked about in silver era plans. Is most of these guys were not using a very tight rep range. Some of the strength-based guys were, obviously we talked about people like Hepburn a little bit and Reg Park, and some of these guys who are using more, doubles and triples and fours and fives. And, sometimes those guys will work between, 1 or 2 repetitions in that range. But generally speaking, from a hypertrophy perspective, 5 to 10, 6 to 12, they ended up being the most common kind of ranges for people to work through. And in modern programming, what I was taught and what I see most people do, we're kind of taught to use a very narrow range. Normally it's like 6 to 8 or 8 to 10, 10 to 12. It's like 2 repetitions. And not that that's bad. And obviously we've got access to equipment now that people didn't have access to back then. But we've talked about, well, what are you getting differently out of a set of 10 and a set of 5? Well, arguably a tiny, tiny bit more fatigue, like nothing really significant that's that different, especially from a stimulus perspective. So it makes sense to me to use these slightly larger ranges, 5 to 10, and then have that flexibility where if your machine or your equipment doesn't allow you to do such small progressions in load, and if going up in load means that suddenly you can't lift a single repetition with it, well, you've got, this huge range there to actually play with. So I think this makes, for me personally, I think this makes more sense just as a programming variable to use today, especially for people who have limited equipment, than what we see most people doing.
Totally. And I mean, like we were chatting about this before podcast, and I said I always like to choose the exercise or the equipment for the exercise based on how the exercise feels rather than based on what the loading capacity is. So, if one piece of kit has very sort of limited loading kind of increments that they're fixed and I can't really change them very easily, but that means that there are big jumps, then I'm going to have a wider kind of rep range when I'm working with that piece of kit. Otherwise, every time I go up a notch, I'm going to be completely incapable of sticking in the rep range that I want to work in. But if I really want to use that piece of kit, then that's just a cost of doing business, if you like. But I'd always prioritize the exercise because of how it feels, because of what I'm trying to achieve in the location that I'm trying to work, in the body, rather than saying, oh no, I've got to work in this rep range, therefore I've got to use this other piece of kit, which is not quite perfect for what I want to do. It doesn't feel very good, but it allows me to micro-load. Like, well, that isn't the way around that I'd want to work. I'd always want to go for the exercise, the biomechanical reasons rather than the loading parameter reasons. So I'm in the same place as you. I think it's always better to have that rep range kind of being a little bit more flexible.
Which brings us to what we want to discuss for the second half of this podcast, which is progression models and how to do that, what that means, we've talked about progressive overload before, but we'll just touch on that a little bit in context of what a progression model is and what that achieves and what kind of rate of progression might people be able to expect when they're in the gym. And, I've made this comment in the past where while we do see some pretty funky programs, I think that the most important determinant of whether a program works for someone or not is the way that it's executed. And I think that too often people, and this, I don't want to blame individuals who are just following a program too much. Like, I think that a lot of the time this comes down to instruction from the coach, where there's poor expectation setting and there's poor instruction over how to, whether that's reps in reserve, whether that's rest periods, whether that's just, expectation of how strong one should be getting or can expect to get. And often I'll get messages from people being like, I've plateaued. My chest, this is a message I get like every week. It'll be, my chest can't recover from being trained 3 times a week. And I'll say, well, have you dropped a single set? Have you tried that? How do you know? And they'll be like, yep, a single set, I can't recover from a single set. It's always chest. It's always, or maybe biceps, but usually chest. And then I ask them, well, how are you determining that you're not recovering? What rate of progression are you looking for? And like always, it'll be that, well, I can't progress weight weekly. I've gone 2 or 3 sessions and I haven't been able to progress. And I'll always write out like basically I'll write out sort of like a Hepburn style, double progression method for those people and be like, hey, just try this. Tell me how you go. And almost always I'll get a message back in a few weeks' time. Oh my God, I'm progressing again. I hadn't plateaued. And it's like, okay, so it wasn't a recovery issue. It's simply that you didn't know what to expect as far as what progression actually is. So maybe we start the conversation there. What is progression? What is progressive overload? What do these terms actually tell us? What do these concepts tell us? And then we can jump into the practicality of it all.
Yeah, in fact, if you don't mind, I'd like to go back even one step further and kind of give us a runway into that because I'm kind of hoping to really capture almost everything possible in this episode related to progression. So let me add one bit on the front of that and we'll kind of hopefully get a flying start into that concept that you just identified. So the thing that I want to kind of start with is to give people a little bit of history into why there's some confusion about what progression means and how we use it. It's because we have 2 totally different histories or cultures or usages in this particular way. And one of the usages, which is very popular in the Olympic weightlifting community, in powerlifting to a certain extent, and it has been used in the strength training communities for bodybuilding in certain aspects, basically treats progression as a programming decision. So basically and it often fits into a block periodization type context. So somebody will be writing a strength training program and they'll go, I'm going to program these things or these loading protocols or these sets, reps, whatever in this week or these 2 weeks or these 3 weeks. And then I'm going to change them and do this in the following weeks and then something else in these other weeks. So they are proactively changing the loading protocols over time, and they are referring to that as progression. And Often what you'll see is that either there will be an increase in the amount of volume that's being done, or you'll see an increase in the intensity. Now, that could be intensity in the old-fashioned way of talking about it, which is percentage of 1 rep max, or it could be in the kind of more commonly used today way of talking about it, which is the number of reps in reserve. Doesn't really matter. And you'll see a progression in that terminology. So what they're saying is we are perhaps starting out with 4 or 5 reps in reserve, then moving to 2 or 3 reps in reserve, then finishing up with 1 or 2 reps in reserve. So they'll say this is a progression. And then, or alternatively, it could be percentage of 1 rep max. They could say we're going to start with 75%, move up to 80%, move to 85, and they'll call that progression. Or it could be volume, as I say. Start out with 1 set, move up to 2 sets, move up to 3 sets, 4 sets. Again, it doesn't really matter, but the point is that you are increasing some aspect, and they are describing either more workload being done, training close to failure, or using heavier loads. So in all of these aspects, they are proactively programming an increase in either the load or the volume, or sort of some other kind of parameter that is related to the strength training program. Is this making sense so far?
Yeah, absolutely. And most people, I guess, will have probably seen a program like that, especially in a powerlifting context. People will be familiar with this, where, week 1, like you said, will be X number of reps at this percentage. Week 2 will be this. It usually changes week by week, doesn't it?
It does. Now, the important thing is that from a physiological perspective, this has got nothing to do with progress or progression. Absolutely nothing to do with that, because it is totally physiologically possible, unlikely, because strength training works, okay? So strength training works, so you're likely to see adaptations happening, but that's not the point. It is physiologically possible to do a program like this and not actually progress.
And
So
actually follow it properly, like actually do the
correct,
numbers, do the
correct.
sets, do the
Yes,
reps, everything that it has actually programmed,
yes.
and not progress. Yeah.
Unlikely, because strength training works, but
Mhm.
it is feasible. And so what we need to understand is that the entire block periodization terminologies are not physiologically correct, because they are assuming that you can proactively make a progression happen by writing it on a piece of paper, and you can't. All you're doing is you're changing the within workout demands of, kind of how fatiguing it's going to be and how many stimulating reps you're going to get, at least from a bodybuilding perspective. So all that's changing is that you're, as I say, changing very slightly how much recovery you're going to get, and how much recovery you need, and you're changing how much of a stimulus you're actually providing. What you're not doing is progressing or you're not guaranteeing progression by doing that. There is no progression there. You are artificially creating the illusion of progression by
Mhm.
progressing numbers on a piece of
Mhm.
paper. That does not translate automatically to progression in the individual's adaptive processes. And this is super, super important, because I get many, many, many messages from people asking about progression and progressive overload, and their entire worldview is rooted in what I'm describing now, this block periodization idea that you can write on a piece of paper what you want people to do, and it's somehow going to make them progress, and it doesn't. It doesn't automatically do that. You're just describing something on paper that has nothing to do with physiological reality. Now, as I say, strength training works. So, chances are that they will actually progress, but it has nothing to do with the progression that you are describing on that kind of model. You could equally program the exact same routine, 3 sets, or even 1 set to failure 3 times a week, and it would do pretty much the same thing. I'm not saying it would do exactly
Mhm.
the same thing, but
Mhm.
it could do, and it actually could lead to progression, equally well, or not equally well, again, depending on the person. So, um, that brings me to the other side of the equation. So what I'm saying is that is a worldview which has been kind of foisted
Mhm.
upon us by the periodization enthusiasts, which I'm losing patience with daily, actually. I'm getting to the point where I'm actually going to start being quite critical of it. If I'm not being very critical already, I'm going to start getting even more critical, because I think they're actually being actively problematic for an understanding of what's going on in terms of the adaptions, because the terminology is being used incorrectly. So the other way of thinking about progression is to say, well, if I'm watching what's happening in a strength training program and I am seeing that the person who is maintaining, or the lifter who is maintaining the same proximity to failure, whether that's to failure or they're leaving 1 rep reserve or whatever, and they are actually increasing the number of reps that they're capable of doing, and or they are now starting to put the weight up, I am receiving feedback from that training program that progression is happening, as in I am observing, writing down on a piece of paper the numbers that they're achieving over the course of the training program, that they are actually improving. So on the one hand, we've got this proactive, like input-based progression idea where I'm telling them to do more and more and more each time and get stronger, as if commanding them to get stronger is somehow going to make them stronger. And on the other hand, I'm simply observing the fact that they are now actually getting stronger, and I'm receiving that information, and it's an output of the training program. So I think really what we've got to understand is that there are two totally different ways of using the word progression in the strength training communities, which are overlapping. They do tend to come from different places and get used in different ways, but they are fundamentally different. One is like, if I write down on a piece of paper that someone has to do these things in this order and get stronger, then magically that's somehow going to make them stronger, which I just don't agree with. And on the other hand, there is literally just observing the fact that the person is getting stronger and writing that down and noticing that it is happening, which is an output of the strength training that they are doing. Two totally different perspectives. One I think is fundamentally flawed, and one I actually think is correct, which is the observation of what is actually happening.
I'm trying to put my finger on some subtle differences here, and it's difficult because there's those kind of two polar opposites to an extent, but then there's some overlap and middle ground as well. So I'm thinking of something like a method we've talked about in the past, like the Hepburn method, which you could actually feasibly write down ahead of time. These are the
Yes.
numbers you're going to hit.
Yes.
So it looks very similar to what you've just explained there.
Yes. It does. And that's kind of where you get somebody who is, an absolute genius in kind of strength training, both intuitively and, probably in kind of just the practical skill. I mean, he was just really, really, really good at what he did. And he was able to figure out a rate of progression that would work for most people most of the time. And I speak from, extremely kind of practical experience of this, having run Hepburn model for 18 months on the squat. And yeah, I literally didn't do anything else for 18 months, just ran the whole
Mm,
thing. And yeah, it wave loads essentially, and you're never
mm,
really the same proximity to failure on anything, at any point in time. And there are kind
mm,
of weeks when it feels a bit easier and weeks when it feels a bit harder. And it's like it's a very, very, very artful piece of work, that training program. Like, that's the exception that proves the rule, I think. That kind of thing where you've
mm,
got somebody who's able to create something like that and it does work. I mean, I think it's a strength program. It's not really a bodybuilding program. Uh, but I think that's kind of the exception that proves the rule, where
mm.
you've got something that good. Um, but I don't think most of the other stuff works.
It's almost as if, because you look at something like that and what he's done, what Hepburn did, and we've touched on Hepburn in the past, and basically just, adding one repetition to one low rep set over, weeks. And then eventually as you get up to, 3 or 4 repetitions, depending how you're doing it, you drop back down. And we'll talk about that sort of progressive model more in a moment. But it feels to me like there's a difference here between laying out an expectation of here's how quickly one can expect to get stronger, compared to almost overlapping periodization onto a progression model, and kind of explaining it away with, you're progressing because we're, hitting these different strength qualities, or because we're, advancing volume, or because, and it's pulling it forward. It's like, it's this idea of like, well, we can cause a progression by doing X, as opposed to, you will be progressing probably at this rate, and this is how you can continue to train given how much you're likely to be progressing. And these are very minute differences, but they matter, don't they?
Mhm. Totally, totally. And I think really the genius of Hepburn was that he understood that to create something reliable, it has to be small and contained.
Yeah.
So it was like
Mm.
8 sets of 2 with
Yep.
a 5 rep max approximately, and you gradually add an extra rep on each of your sets until you get to 8 sets of 3, and then you put the weight up a little bit, and then you start again. And that is a small and contained kind of wave loading periodization model, if you like,
Yeah.
that works. Um, and he was really, really good at obviously strength training programming to the point where he was able to create that. Um, when somebody is creating something on the fly I mean, he obviously did that loads of times on his own. He probably saw a whole bunch of other people do it, and he gained a lot of experience with that particular progression model. Um, in contrast, what I see in the kind of wider strength training community today, people are just throwing together programs and go,
Mm.
"Oh, just do these," and like, honestly, you can't do that. You know, you can't just kind of guess the rate of progress,
Mm.
and start pulling programs together that you think are going to
Mm.
kind of work. You've got to limit if you want to get to the point where you can create something as effective as what Hepburn did. You're going to have to limit yourself to a small. I mean, I've tried to do it, and I wasn't actually that happy with what I ended up with. I've tried to do it with, kind of 3 sets of 5 rising to 8, and it kind of works. It just doesn't work for the same amount of time that
Mm.
the 8 sets
Mm.
of 2 to 3 works for. Um, and I think you've got to kind of limit yourself to a relatively small kind of contained progression model, and you've got to make sure it works for you for long periods of time, and you've got to make sure it works for other people for long periods of time, and then sure, wheel it out and like kind of popularize it. Fantastic. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when people are constructing, like on the fly,
Mm.
large sort of full on, strength training programs across multiple exercises, and the things are changing all over the place, and there's percentages flying around, and there's reps in reserve flying around, and there's all kinds of things being changed. And it's like there is literally no way you're going to be able to predict that that's going to work in the way that you're planning it, in the way that you're
Yeah.
writing it.
And I think a lot of it comes down to, and it's almost luck, because it comes down to what variable has that person chosen to periodize or progress or whatever in their plan. Because I've seen plans where people are progressing reps in reserve, and they'll say, this week you're going to do 4 reps in reserve, this week you're going to do 3, this week you're going to do 2, this week, and it's like, what?
There is
How
literally
is
no reason to do that at all.
precisely? But then you might have someone who they've decided to periodize, and maybe they are periodizing repetitions, and they're saying we're doing the same load, but we're adding 1 repetition each week. Or maybe they have, like, there's, depending on what variable you decide to try to progress, you might just be lucky, and that's actually going to be beneficial for that person's actual progression. But if you pick the wrong variable, like reps in reserve, you're just wasting half of those weeks. So yeah, I'm just thinking back to some of the periodized programs I've seen. Okay. Yeah.
But
And I mean,
the point that I'm giving here is not so much that periodization is bad. I mean, it is. But what I'm trying to explain is that most of the confusion that we have today in the fitness industry about what progression means is because the terminology has come through 2 totally different pathways
yeah.
and has different, if you like, cultural settings and references and understandings and concepts behind it. So when people start talking about it, they end up talking across each other. This is why a lot of the time you've got a whole bunch of creators rightly making the case for progression being an output, as in a feedback like information source from the strength training program, which is what we would think of it as in, are you getting stronger? Great, that's progressive overload happening. Whereas you've got a whole bunch of other people going, no, progressive overload, it means that you have to add more into your program over time. And I'm like, no, that's coming from the block periodization community, which is fundamentally wrong. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. It's interesting to wonder when that changed. Because, for example, I've seen videos of Mike Mensa where he'll talk about the the thing that causes the progress will be, say, that final repetition because you're doing something you've not done before. So you need to get an extra rep you haven't done before. Otherwise, your body's not going to be forced to
Yeah,
adapt.
you see, because that's
Right?
just not true. That's just
Exactly.
not how hypertrophy works.
And so we're seeing terminology like, or, narratives like that coming up in the golden era. But then I don't see much of that in the silver era. In the silver era, it's you lift, generally they would talk about, not lifting on the nerve or however they talked about it. So you're not going too failure, you're going to the point of congestion, they would say. So basically, it sounds to me like they're talking about 1 rep in reserve, and then you try to add as load as you can as you realize that you can lift heavier. And it's just more intuitive, like, can you lift heavier? Lift heavier. Can you lift heavier again this week? Lift heavier. And sometimes, we've talked about Hepburn and Bob Hoffman had a similar kind of model where, and funnily enough, he called it the double progressive method, which is every second workout, see if you can add a repetition, right? Not what we would call a double progression method, and terminology gets confusing, but sure, sometimes these people would say, oh, this is probably how fast one can adapt, but they weren't talking about it in the sense of, well, if you don't add this rep, you haven't grown from that workout. So there's clearly been this shift in understanding, belief, whatever, that's happened 70s, 80s.
Yeah, I mean, like the skeptical amongst us might kind of say, well, at the point where anabolic steroids came in and made it impossible to tell what was going on, people just started making stuff up. I mean, that's kind of how I would skeptically
And potentially they were getting
describe
stronger
it.
every session. And so, yeah.
So, but anyway, all I wanted to do was to kind of just add on that little bit of historical kind of perspective, because I don't think anything about progression, any conversation about progression is going to make any sense to anybody unless they understand that the history has given us these two totally different kind of starting points.
Yeah.
And if you've got somebody who's talking to you and they're talking from this perspective of block periodization thinking, and you're talking about it from like well, are you getting stronger? Well, that's what is going to allow you to kind of display progressive overload. If you're thinking about it as an output and they're thinking about it as an input, then neither of you are going to be able to actually connect in the conversation that you're having. And that's, I think, what is happening most of the time on social media. You've just got one group of people talking about it from this perspective, the other group of people talking about it from a different perspective, and nobody's actually able to understand what the other group are saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we would say, well, okay, what is what is progressive overload? Well, progressive overload, which is a horrible terminology because ultimately, it really plays into the block periodization kind of ideas. It really just means, am I getting stronger? Am I able to lift, either a slightly heavier weight or do more repetitions with the same weight as I did last time? Now, somebody who's being really picky could say, well, does it also mean that maybe I can leave, shorter rest periods? Or does it also mean, could I use a slightly larger range of motion? Or, I mean, fine, okay, you can stretch the definition a little bit to include those things if you really wanted to, but generally speaking, in the context practically of most strength training programs, it really just means, can I do more reps to failure, or with the same proximity to failure, or can I lift a heavier weight, really?
I mean, the simplest way to think about it is, did I have to get stronger to be able to do this?
Yes, exactly. That's the best way of actually having an umbrella term across the whole thing.
So, okay, with that as our framework, did we get stronger to achieve this thing? Where does that land us?
What it means is that an adaptation had to have happened in order for us to be able to achieve those new numbers. So one of the strength-related adaptations, not actually in this context, not strictly just strength-related adaptations, but if you're working in a rep range that's above like 3, well, maybe 5, then you also potentially got a little bit of muscular endurance. Now, it starts off being really a little bit. I mean, like, if you look at the kind of adaptations in terms of muscular endurance that happen across rep ranges, 1 to 5, you're not really seeing any kind of improvements in muscular endurance as a result of heavy strength training. As you get above that and towards 10, yes, you start to see a little bit, but honestly, it's not very much. When you clear 15, yeah, it's pretty meaningful. So yeah, if you're working in 5 to 10, you might see a little bit of muscular endurance related adaptations starting to help you as well. So it's not pure maximum strength. There's also a little bit of relative muscular endurance in there as well. So ultimately, if we kind of just work on the basis of maximum strength, obviously you've got your coordination improvements, you've got co-activation reductions, which is more or less the same thing as coordination improvements. We've got motor unit recruitment increases, and then on the peripheral side, we've got hypertrophy, sarcomatogenesis, lateral force transmission, and maybe a little bit of tendon stiffness. Honestly, if we look at the kind of sort of strength training programs over time, if we're starting a new training program and we're doing exercises that we're not familiar with, basically you're going to see just gigantic improvements in coordination and the accompanying reductions in co-activation. I mean, that's just going to happen. If we're not doing that, if we're doing exercises we're very familiar with, then we're not really going to see much of a change on that particular score. Obviously, peripheral side, sarcomatogenesis is only really going to happen if we're kind of, relatively, that's a relatively novel stimulus to us. Lateral force transmission, we don't really know very much about. So broadly speaking, tendon stiffness tends to plateau. So most of the time, we're really kind of seeing hypertrophy as the main driver of, kind of strength gains in well-trained people who are familiar with the exercises. Now, does that mean you're not getting any of the other stuff if you're well-trained? Well, no, it doesn't. You're still going to get a little bit of that kind of thing. But we are going to see that, relatively speaking, hypertrophy is going to be a pretty big component of the strength gains of most people most of the time in routines that they are relatively familiar with. Now, interestingly, what most people tend to do when they've been doing a routine for a couple of months and they start to see that their gains in strength are really grindy, they start to go, oh, I need to do something different. I'm like, no, you're just having it revealed to you precisely how fast hypertrophy is contributing to your strength gains. That's what's happening.
That's a really important point. And that's something I always try to sort of drive home with clients. When people have come from a background where they've been changing plans every 4 weeks, doing new exercises every few weeks, and they're expecting to be progressing, often, adding 5 kilos or 10 kilos a week to a lift because it's a new lift for them. And then they get 4, 5, 6 weeks in and they start to see that slow down. They start to think that that's them plateauing and like, okay, I need a new lift. I need a new exercise. I need a new phase. And the way I'll explain that to clients is, no, actually what's happening now is now we're actually just seeing the hypertrophy. And yes, like you said, there's going to be some of these other bits and pieces that are still coming along, but most of it now is actually going to be due to adding contractile proteins, as opposed to all these neural adaptations, coordination, et cetera, you were getting previously. Which is why, we've talked about this in the past. If you're programming new phases, sure, there can be, maybe repetitions might change, exercise order might change, you might do some unilateral stuff, whatever, but by and large, the core exercise selection should really stay consistent across phases, unless, why do you need to change it out? Okay, there's a better exercise you've identified. You want to split that sort of muscle and then focus on different regions, or maybe that exercise is hurting you. But just changing it out because you're now progressing at a slower rate, that's really where the magic is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, that is a really, really critical point that I think practically is very helpful to take on board. That when we start to see an exercise progressing very, very slowly because we've been doing it for a number of months, absolutely is the time to, be super clear about the fact that the rate of gains on the strength on that exercise are slow because pretty much all of the strength gains are coming from hypertrophy. And we've just got to let the rate of progress be what it is. And that's just such a great kind of encapsulation of what progressive overload really is, which is that it is a feedback to us about the success of adaptions happening in the context of the strength training program. Now, I'm saying adaptions because it is adaptions. It is all of the adaptions, and therefore the rate of progress will be faster when there are more adaptions happening, as in when we're unfamiliar with the exercise or we've got, kind of capacity to increase recruitment or sarcomatogenesis or whatever it may be. You are going to see faster rate of progress because you are getting more individual adaptions. As you get fewer and fewer adaptions, you will see a slower rate of progress. It doesn't mean that hypertrophy is happening at a different rate. Hypertrophy is probably happening at the same rate all the way through. It's just that you were getting other adaptions earlier that you're now not getting later on. So progressive overload is the feedback that you are achieving some adaptions, and the larger the rate of progressive overload, the rate of progress, the more adaptions likely are actually occurring. And of course, just because the rate of progress is slow, probably just means that we're just getting hypertrophy towards the end of that, time spent training with that particular exercise.
So if someone's not progressing, you can't just force that progression. Yeah, I think that's a key distinction to make here, because the way people talk about progressive overload, they're like, well, you're not progressing because you haven't got enough volume. You just need to add more volume that'll get you to progress. Or you're not progressing because you haven't planned the progression in the way you sort of talked about earlier. And what you're saying is, well, no. You're not progressing because the program itself obviously has missed the mark in terms of the stimulus and the variables in recovery and whatever else. And that's what we need to be focusing on, not just saying, well, we need to just undulate volume, or we need to undulate intensity or whatever, yeah?
So this is a really important point. I mean, this might end up being a separate podcast topic, to be honest. But I mean, what we can say, to begin with, what we can say is that, as I've said before, stimulus is not really volume dependent. So what I mean by that is that if I do a single repetition of an exercise and it qualifies as a stimulating repetition, so let's say I've got a 5-rep max and I do a single repetition, and that has a high level of motor unit accruement, and it has a slow movement velocity leading to high level of mechanical tension, and I don't have any fatigue mechanisms present, or very much fatigue present. So I'm definitely getting my high level of accruement, my high level of effort. I'm definitely getting my high level of tension with my slow movement velocity. That has accomplished a stimulus for hypertrophy. If I then do another repetition or several repetitions, 48 hours later, and then again 48 hours later, and I'm avoiding any opportunity for atrophy to occur, and I'm continuing to add the stimulus, then I will end up adding muscle mass over time. There is no scenario where doing insufficient volume is going to be an issue there. I mean, okay, fine. If you're doing single reps, like, kind of every other day, then it might take you 6 months to notice anything meaningful happening. But, like if you're doing just a single set and you're getting 5 stimulating reps, or you're doing maybe just 1 rep in reserve or whatever, there is no scenario in which that is failing to achieve hypertrophy, as long as my criteria for hypertrophy are being met. So if somebody is out there arguing that somehow that routine is failing because not enough volume is being done, and that someone needs to go in and do 2 sets or 3 sets or 4 sets instead of a single set, I just fundamentally disagree with them, because qualitatively, the stimuli criteria are being met. Therefore, hypertrophy will happen. Yes, if you do a little bit more volume, you will increase the magnitude of that stimulus, and so you'll make progress very slightly faster. But it's not linear. Your second set is going to give you probably 40% of your first set on top of what you're getting, which is not a huge amount more. And it's costing you in terms of fatigue, so it's going to affect the other stuff that you're doing. So genuinely speaking, I think it's fundamentally not really valid to say, oh, well, you're not progressing on 1 set 3 times a week, therefore you should do 2 sets or 3 sets. I'm like, no, if you're not progressing on 1 set 3 times a week, then either it's just that your progress is slow, or that you've actually capped out and you need to fundamentally change the exercise that you're doing by increasing the capacity of motor unit accruement. So you either need to, kind of move the exercise earlier in the workout, or you need to do single kind of limb, single joint stuff to try and get access to more motor unit accruement, or you need to do something that actually increases accruement as an adaptation. So maybe think about doing some isometrics before you even start the workout, just like as a warm-up protocol to try and push motor unit accruement to a higher level as an adaptation. But simply just doing more volume is okay, you're going to move very slightly faster, but it's not qualitatively changing. What I want to be really clear about is that, yes, you are quantitatively moving slightly faster, but you're not qualitatively changing anything. So, if you were to say, well, you're not progressing on this on set 3 times a week, therefore do 3 sets and you will progress. No, that's not valid. What you can argue is you're progressing very slowly on 1 set 3 times a week, and I think you could progress faster on 2 or 3 sets 3 times a week. Totally acceptable argument. What is not acceptable as an argument is to say 1 set is not creating a stimulus and 3 sets will create a stimulus. That is fundamentally so physiologically flawed, it's actually getting me quite worked up to even think about it. It is not a valid statement. It is not a valid statement. It's not even an argument. I don't know how people can make that argument.
So I think that's really important, because what you said there is, if the requirements for hypertrophy are being met, then like we need to identify that first and foremost, right? So I made this point a few weeks ago where I said I think people are putting too much emphasis on progressive overload, because to your point, if we know that the program is meeting those requirements, we don't need to get that caught up in the progressive overload. It's there as a litmus test to see, is the program actually working or not? But if the requirements are there, why would the program not be working, right? So then ultimately what we've got is an issue of expectation. Yeah. So if we know the requirements are all met for hypertrophy to be achieved, then what we've got is someone expecting to progress quicker than they actually are able to? And that's what you said there, where you said, okay, maybe adding more volume might get someone progressing more quickly than they would be otherwise, but they are still hypertrophying.
It does not change whether or not they will, unless they're doing a really silly program. Okay, fine. If somebody's training like, body part split and doing one workout a week, then yes, at that point, the number of sets per workout does change whether or not they make progress. Because if they do 3 sets, then it's going to basically stay standing still. If they do 5, then okay, they'll make a bit of progress. But fundamentally, if they're training 2 or 3 times a week, then the number of sets does not determine whether or not they make progress. All it does is slightly change the rate of that progress. So yeah, I think basically, as you say, what we want to do is say, well, look, is the program, going to work? Is it actually physiologically plausible? In which case, let it run for a couple of weeks and look for a strength gain over a longer period of time. And if it's there, then the program is working. It's just happening slowly. So chances are not that you're gaining muscle mass really slowly, actually, is that you're just not getting any other adaptions. I think this is a really important point. People go, oh, I'm not gaining any muscle mass because I'm making strength gains really slowly. I'm like, probably nothing to do with that. It's probably that you're not getting any other adaptions at all. So actually your rate of hypertrophy could be the same as it was when you were making super fast strength gains and you were getting really excited. When you're getting really excited, it was just coordination. Yeah. So the reality is your excitement is not a good metric for whether or not your muscle mass rate of progress is actually, kind of good or bad.
Yeah, and if you just think about how much muscle are you actually growing realistically, are you expecting that to translate to, kilos and kilos on the bar every week? Well, obviously not, if we're talking about grams of contractile tissue being added. So the way I see it is progressive overload is just confirmation that the program is working, and progressive models are just expectation management. Does that check out?
I think so in the context of the Hepburn model that you introduced earlier, yes, I think that's completely fair to call Hepburn model an expectation management tool. I think it is more than that. I think it is a very strong guideline for keeping people within a sort of set and rep in reserve protocol, because the reps in reserve in Hepburn are changing all the time. And that's the genius of it. That's the thing, when you really sit down and start playing with it, you realize that your reps in reserve are moving, and they're moving in quite a subtle way constantly, where you're kind of ending up brushing up against failure right at the very end, but you're not really getting there. And that just seems to hover around about the same kind of place all the time, which is the genius part. And that's where it's not only expectation management, it's actually kind of adaption prediction, because it is literally predicting that your adaptions will take you to a certain point and leave you with reps in reserve at that particular point, at that point in your kind of progress in the cycle. So it's both expectation management, it's also adaption prediction, which is the bit that people think they can do with block periodization models, and they can't, because they're not at the level that Hepburn was at, and they're not really kind of limiting themselves to what Hepburn limited himself to. I mean, Hepburn limited himself to, as I said before, to a very, very tiny kind of rep set kind of protocol, and it works. Whereas people with a fraction of his experience and understanding and capacity are trying to do far more complex things, and it's just not really working at all. But what we can say is then, a progression model is potentially an expectation management tool, but also it could be a framework. because Hepburn's is both of those things. It's a framework that sits around what you're doing and it limits you and says you can't do, in Hepburn, 8 sets of 2 rising to 3. You can't do anything other than 8 sets, and you can't do anything other than 2 or 3 repetitions. I mean, that's kind of your limitations.
Yeah.
So it's a framework and it's an expectations management tool. If you kind of take the classic kind of way that most people today are programming bodybuilding kind of set rep protocols, they're going to do the same number of sets most of the time. Okay, you've got some crazy people doing, kind of all kinds of weird things, but, like fine, most people most of the time are doing the same number of sets per workout, per exercise. And, they're going to do sort of a rep range. And when they get to the upper end of that rep range, they're going to, switch the weight up and they're going to start again at the bottom end of the rep range. And that's kind of what we saw actually today with the program that you introduced us to, where you've got 5 to 10 repetitions. And the idea being that you would start at 5 and then you would sort of increase up towards 10, and then you would add the weight and drop down back towards 5 again. And then we made the point that practically speaking, that could be a little bit more malleable. Actually, if the equipment that you've got means that when you get to the upper end of that rep range, you then switch to the next weight up, and actually it drops you a little bit below your target starting point. Okay, well then, that's just what the equipment is forcing you to do. So instead of it being 5 to 10, it might be 4 to 11. And that's just because that's the dumbbells that you've got access to, or that's the selectorized machine that you've got access to. And that's just pushing you in that particular direction. Now, technically, somebody could say, well, I just want to progress load. And you can say, well, you're going to have a really, really difficult time with that unless you've got like sort of really clever setup in your equipment. You've got micro loading capacities, and then technically, yes, you could stick around 5 or 6 reps all the time, and you could micro load and make sure that you're always capable of doing that. Yeah, not many people are going to do that though. Similarly, you could also kind of say, well, I'm just going to carry on increasing repetitions forever. Well, you're going to run into fatigue issues by doing that, because the higher up the rep range you go, the more you're going to start finding that you can't do as many, kind of other things in the workout. You can't keep with your same kind of frequency protocols if you kind of bump up against the top end of that rep range. So broadly speaking, you're probably always going to have what I guess some people call double progression, which is, it gets used, as you pointed out, in multiple different ways, different people at different times. But you could argue in this context, it just means, I'm working with a weight progression and a rep range progression. And I'm just going to manage those so I stay in this rep range all the time and just allow weights to increase over time. And the thing is that in the context of what a lot of people are doing, that process is just happening on its own. So we just go to the gym and we just lift to failure, and we just write down where we get to, or we got to, or where we are getting to, or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, this time I didn't make any progress. Okay, well, I write down that I didn't make any progress. Next time I don't make any progress. Okay, well, I write that down again. And the third time, okay, now I'm adding a repetition. Okay, great, fantastic. And then it just kind of happens gradually over time, and then we just notice over a long period of time that progression is happening. And the wording progressive overload is, as I say, really distracting, because it sounds like we should be doing something proactive, but it's not really the case. It's just telling us that we are progressing over time, and that's a totally valid way of making progress and verifying that the strength training program is working. Equally, you could do exactly the same thing and you leave 1 rep in reserve all the time. That is doable. You just have to be very clear with yourself about what 1 rep in reserve feels like, and then literally you are, and that sounds like what a lot of silver era lifters were actually doing, just leaving that last rep in reserve and just doing the exact same program. So it doesn't have to be trained to failure to work in exactly the same way. So I think that probably is the most practical answer for most people most of the time, either to failure or 1 rep in reserve within the rep range of, and I like 5 to 8, 5 to 10, 5 to 7, whatever you want to do. But again, I think it works with, a larger number of rep ranges than that.
Yeah, good. So practically speaking, easy. So you add a repetition as able to, that could be once a week. Some ways I like to do that for beginners. I often say, look, every workout, you're probably going to add a repetition to each exercise and each set of that exercise. And then for someone who's intermediate, well, it might be that we're adding a repetition to 1 set each workout. And then someone who's advanced, it might be we're trying to add 1 repetition to 1 set for that exercise per week. Obviously, if you're doing multiple sets compared to single sets, if you're doing an A-B split, that's going to differ a little bit. But just as a bit of a rule of thumb, obviously beginners are going to be progressing a lot quicker than an intermediate quicker than an advanced. So you're saying, okay, let's add a repetition. We get to the top of that rep range. And what I think is a helpful practical point, and you've alluded to this stuff is going to be based on the exercise. It's based on the equipment. So I might program people 5 to 10 and say, look, we're going to do whatever exercise. We'll do every exercise 5 to 10. And I say, you may find for the exercise you're doing, some exercises may have smaller loading increments, and you may just feel better going in between 5 to 7. Totally fine. Other exercises, maybe you go down to 5, the machine just doesn't feel good, or maybe it's got larger loading increments, and so maybe you need to go from 6 to 10, or you go from 5 to 10. I don't really mind. Yeah, I would give people a window there where, hey, this needs to suit you, and it needs to suit the exercise, and it needs to suit the machine or the equipment you've got access to. And then you get to the top of that range, whatever that is for you, you add a little bit of load and you come back down. Now, there's 2 ways to do that. I mean, really, there's one way to do that, isn't there? Is you add the smallest increment of load that you can, right? Now, typically, I would say to someone, ideally, I want that to be about 1% per repetition we're coming down. So you've gone from 5 to 10. Okay, we're going to go back from 10 down to 5, just like what we saw at the start of this program. And I want you to add about 5% total load, because we're going down 5 repetitions. Now, what I find with people is that 5% load, or that 1% per repetition we're dropping, it should be manageable for basically everyone. Everyone should be able to do that and find, you know what, I've gone to 5 and I feel like I've actually got a repetition reserve now. Okay, so I'm erring on more of like a conservative side with that loading parameter. And it allows me not to overshoot. Someone drop down to 5, but I can't lift the load, I feel demotivated, whatever. And worst case scenario, okay, we're 2 reps in reserve, we're getting slightly less stimuli for that 1 week. Well, it doesn't matter, because next week we're upping it again. We're going to 6. So that's a really practical way of doing that double progression method, like you said there. You mentioned it's hard sometimes to just add load. I find if I'm using very low repetitions with people, like sub 5, my preference is to try to microload. And to try to go, let's add the smallest increment of load we can, ideally fractional plates, each workout or each week. And if that's too much, so, ideally we'll do something like a Hepburn method. We'll have multiple sets. We're adding, because usually if we're doing less than 5 reps, we will have multiple sets anyway, let's be realistic. So then I'll say, let's add the smallest amount of load possible to one of those sets per workout or per week. And if that is still too fast of a progression, then I'll normally just go between 1 repetition, just like Hepburn did. I'll go from 5 to 6 or from 4 to 5 and then back down. So I find that the high repetitions, or I guess maybe the way to think about it, the lower repetitions, it's more viable to just be reliant on load. And if we're using moderate repetitions, we're going to have to be using a repetition scheme there as well as just progressing loading.
Yeah, totally. I mean, but I would kind of, I would still want to frame that in the context that the limiting factor in each workout really wants to be the either point of failure or the 1 rep in reserve, or 2 reps in reserve, or whatever reps in reserve the person is going to do. And then you're just getting feedback from the kind of loading protocols. I mean, you're refining your kind of loading protocols to kind of land people in a particular kind of rep range. That's all you're doing. That's the sort of the science behind what you're kind of sort of doing there, which is cool, because I mean that it's a management of expectations and a management of motivation, as you've already pointed out, which is great, but it's not 100% necessary. You could just go with the flow of what the equipment gives you, as I've said. Kind of just, I get stuck in whatever kind of commercial gym I'm in, and the selectorized machine is whatever it is, and I kind of do a week or 2 with a particular load, and then I put the weight up and I just see how many reps I get, and it is what it is, and that's okay.
And especially for single sets, that's for my own training. That's what I do with single sets. If I'm doing, again, say 3 sets of 4 to 5 repetitions, I'll be a little bit more strategic in managing my expectation with that loading. But, it's not popular, but like, I said this before, I think progressive overload is overrated. I really think this idea of like beat the logbook, and it's been drilled into people, and I understand why and understand it was important, but I feel like we've gone too far, and I feel like now it causes anxiety in people, and it it's it's now become a master, and it's like, well, it was there all along just to serve us, to show us that in fact we are progressing on a workout. We just need to be able to look back and show, are we progressing, from 4 weeks ago or 2 months
Yeah,
ago or
exactly.
whatever.
Exactly.
And this idea that we need to be beating the logbook every single session, it's just not realistic. And you see this with a lot of the silver era guys. How often will you look at a magazine or something and they'll be like, oh, this person, Steve would incline bench, 10 repetitions of whatever, 135-pound dumbbells or whatever. And you look at it and it's like, how often was he doing that for this to be recorded? For everyone to know this is the weight this guy does for incline bench. What, was he doing that for 2 years? Like how slow was this guy's progress that we knew that's what he lifted? And the idea now that you need to progress every lift every week, aim to do it, sure. But if you're an advanced lifter, I mean, we've touched on this in the past, is at a certain point, maybe some of those lifts are there just to maintain what you've got, and you're not actually going to progress them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have talked to people in the past who've made the same point to me in their own training, that they're like, I'm really not seeing any growth on this exercise. I'm just doing it because if I don't, then I shall lose the muscle mass that I've built. And I'm like,
Exactly.
yeah, okay.
Yep. Drop it
You
down
know,
to a single set, do it twice a week, done.
that's just how it is. But yeah, I mean, I think the key point here, the physiological reality, is that the improvement is a feedback mechanism to tell you that an adaptation is happening. And if it's a exercise that you're very familiar with, then that should be mostly hypertrophy. And in an advanced sort of muscle, again, advanced lifter is a kind of a bit of an emotive term, but if the muscle is kind of at a very, very well developed state, then you're not going to really see a very, very fast rate of progress. And so it's going to be, probably every kind of 3 or 4 workouts at best, where you're going to see reps increasing, or the load increasing. But fundamentally, that's just how fast the muscle gains are going to be. And there's not really anything we can do about that. Well, not to remain a natural lifter anyway.
So is there anything else, practically speaking, that's a helpful tip for people to know? I think it's helpful to people to know you're not going to always progress every single workout. If you are, it's probably because you're doing new exercises and that's not actually helping you in the way you think it's helping you. So that's helpful. We've talked about, here's a progressive model you can use, double progression, add a rep. When you get to the top of whatever range you're using, add some load, come back down, go again. We've talked about the fact that, hey, progressive overload is just there over time to show you what you're doing is working. It's not dictating your workout. It's not pulling forwards adaptation. It's not causing the muscle growth. It's just feedback. Is there anything else that would be helpful for people to know? You've mentioned like, going to that 0 reps in reserve or 1 rep in reserve being that sort of litmus test for working out your loading and whatnot. And, honestly, that's probably one of the most important points here is, again, if the parameters make sense, you're not doing stupid amounts of volume, you're not doing frequency that doesn't make sense. If you are going to 0 reps in reserve, 1 rep in reserve, 2 reps in reserve, and it truly is, then that adaptation has to be happening, really, or you've maxed out your size potential, right? I think that's probably one of the most practical pieces here is a lot of these progression models we're talking about. Yes, A, they're managing expectation, but B, they're also trying to keep people accountable to training close enough to failure. And as long as you're aware of that and you're aware, hey, you're not going to progress if you are 4 reps in reserve, 5 reps in reserve, 6, like you just let that float away and you use the same load, sure, you're not going to progress because you have gotten stronger and you haven't added the load over time. And now you are 5 reps in reserve. So as long as you're aware of that and you are taking yourself to a close proximity to failure, then all this other stuff, like I said, it's just feedback over time.
Totally.
Any other practical points for people?
Honestly, I think I just reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is that if your interest in progressive overload and progress is more on the academic side and you're trying to understand what it is that people are talking about when they're talking about progress and progressive overload and what it means and how it connects to adaptions, just be aware that there are these two totally different usages or descriptions or kind of ways of talking about it which have come from two totally different places in the kind of strength training, historical context. And so you will find that if you read certain sources or listen to certain people talk, you will be getting either the kind of the block periodization culture, if you like, which I just fundamentally don't think is describing what's going on correctly, or alternatively, you'll be getting this kind of more adaptation physiological kind of description of what is happening in terms of progressive overload, which is the feedback, which is what we're talking about. So, if you are interested in this area and you're reading and you're listening to people talk about it, that kind of thing, just be aware that that is happening. And that'll help you sort of make sense of the ways that people are talking about it and why there are these disagreements and discrepancies. But yeah, from a practical point of view, most of the time, I think most people are just going to be able to start working with an exercise, try and work within a given rep range and modify it as they go along by simply noticing what rep range they land on when they put the weight up. So if I
It's
go
pretty
to the
basic, isn't it?
if
Yeah,
I go
like
to
science.
like I've just started working out in the new gym a week and a half ago, and there's a really, really nice seated row machine, which has a wonderful action, one of the best actions I've come across in seated rows for a very long time. So I really like it. And it has it selectorized. And so I just put the kind of selector in on a weight and I got like sort of 6 or 7 reps, I forget. And then I pushed that up to 8 and I thought, well, I'll put it up a little bit more, put it up the next one. And whatever reps I got is what the reps I got. And then I shall now work in like the 5 to 9 or 5 to 8, whatever it is that I've discovered is appropriate for that situation. And it might actually change over time. You might find that as I get stronger on that machine, it just tweaks slightly because some adaptations, the coordination stuff is stopping happening and it might affect the way that I'm working in that rep range. I don't know. But I'm not stressing about it. I'm just going to work with what the machine gives me. I think a lot
Science-based
of
lifting
people.
gets this bad name for overcomplicating things, and this is so simple. We're making this as simple as possible. I don't know if you've ever used like the old Nautilus equipment. So the ones before, they were like this selectorized stuff that had like it was this weird double prong that would go in. I have no idea why they did it like that. And so you'll have like each weight plate will have a hole, and then you got this pin you go in that's got 2 holes or 2 pins to go into holes, and you just have no idea what weight you're using, right? Like I can't work out for the life of me, and the plates are barely numbered as it is, and that has been a very useful tool in losing that emotional attachment to having to have this perfected progressive kind of model where I don't know, it was 1 up, 1 down. I don't know. I just put it in and I go to 0 reps in reserve and I got 6 reps out. Great. It doesn't matter that much, does it?
Well, that's the thing. I think, if we are, well, I mean, just being a bit kind of clear there. I mean, again, assuming that we're talking about single sets to failure. I mean, things can get messy if we've got fatigue present from a previous set or a previous exercise with the same muscle group. But yeah, broadly speaking, as if I'm going to use the seated row machine and I've just done a press before that and I do the press and then it takes me actually because of the size of the gym I'm working in, the different floors I have to walk up. I have to walk up, different floor and a mezzanine and across the way to get to the row machine that I want to use, threading my way through all these different pieces of kit. I get to the seated row, sit down, do a warm up and then start. And then it's like, okay, well, I did that I did that weight last time. That's that pin there, and then put the pin up. Okay, and then I just get what reps I get, and it's okay. Well, then that just goes in the logbook, and then just do it again over the next couple of weeks and see what happens. And I think there's definitely a tendency for people to overthink and get sort of emotionally disturbed by either the lack of progress or whether or not they're doing it correctly or anything like that. And it's like you're just recording feedback. It's like, how strong are you on the day? Fine, it goes in the logbook as a piece of information, and then just look at the trends over time. I don't think people are going to benefit sort of psychologically from trying to force themselves to hit, sort of a new,
Mm,
strength goal every single time they go in the gym
mm.
as a natural lifter. I don't think that's a good idea. Um, I think it's better to treat it as feedback and, just do the best you can on each day.
Yeah, and you'll just see form, technique will start to break down if one
Well,
tries to do that, they'll get injured.
that is definitely the risk.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's so funny to think that people would think that a set done near failure might not cause adaptions just because you
Well,
didn't
well, that's the
do.
same thing really as I mean, like, ultimately, that's the intensities sort of, argument where the volume argument is being made. So, like, you made the comment about Mike Mensa, sort of talking about needing to, do an extra rep or hit failure or whatever in
Mm,
order to
mm,
trigger the adaptation. Well, that's really just the intensity kind of view of what the volume guys are arguing, which is that unless you do more volume, you're not really
mm,
going to trigger. And I mean, both of them are talking nonsense.
mm,
It's like, is the repetition stimulating or not? If it is stimulating, then qualitatively you have stimulated the adaptation. Quantitatively, it might be quite small, but qualitatively, you cannot say that the adaptation hasn't happened. And I think this is where physiologically, sort of starting physiologically and trying to understand how
mm.
things are actually being stimulated is really, really important because it stops you making these ridiculously absurd claims. Like, unless your, intensity is off the charts, then nothing's going to happen. Unless your volume is off the charts, nothing's going to happen. And you can't do that from external parameters. You can't do that with volume
Mm.
sort of intensity and things like that. It's got to come from, what is the physiological reality. If a stimulating rep has happened, then hypertrophy has been stimulated. End of story.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, I think that's it for us. I've battled noisy birds, a construction site,
You've had
and
it all
shouty
today. You've had it
neighbors.
all.
Yeah, so hopefully you guys were less distracted than I was. We'll be back next week. I mean, that's my reward for our 1 year and 1 week podcast episode. But we'll be back next week with a new topic. But just to quickly say, these topics that we've been doing lately have been topics you guys have been asking for. And so they've been selected from questions you guys have asked, either myself or Chris, and you said, hey, we want to know more about this, or I don't understand this topic. That's helpful. We want this stuff to be valuable to you guys. So keep doing that. Keep letting us know what kind of stuff you're interested in, what topics you feel like there's maybe some ambiguity over. If it's a topic we've covered in the past and maybe, we haven't covered it in depth as much as you guys would find helpful, let us know. Okay, that's it. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll be back next week.